Devonshire, September 1811. The fourth nursemaid left on a Tuesday. She gave her notice to Mrs. Cresswell at 7:30 in the morning, before the household had fully woken, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had packed her trunk the night before and had no intention of being persuaded to stay. Mrs. Cresswell, who had served as housekeeper at Ashworth Hall for 22 years and had outlasted 2 dukes, 1 war, and a chimney fire that had taken the entire East Wing, received this information with the expression she reserved for situations that were both entirely expected and profoundly inconvenient. The reason, as it had been the reason for the previous 3, was the child. Lady Sable Trevane was 5 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and a quality of stillness that people who did not know her mistook for good behavior. People who did know her understood that the stillness was not compliance. It was observation. She watched everything with the complete, unblinking attention of a child who had learned very early that the world was a place where people left, and that it was worth paying close attention to who was going to leave next. She had not spoken to the fourth nursemaid in 11 days. Not out of spite, Mrs. Cresswell would have explained to anyone who asked, and several people had. Not out of willfulness, though the word had been used more than once in the servants' hall, out of something more precise than either. The child had simply looked at the fourth nursemaid on a Wednesday morning and decided, with the categorical certainty that only very young children and very old judges possess, that this person was temporary. And Lady Sable did not invest in temporary people. The Duke of Ashworth was informed of the departure over breakfast. He received it the way he received most domestic information, with a nod that acknowledged the fact and a silence that declined to engage with its implications. Edric Trevane was 34 years old, tall in the way of the Trevane men, with a jaw that communicated decision even when the man behind it had made none. And he had spent the 2 years since his wife's death managing his grief the way he managed his estate, with structure, with discipline, and with the absolute minimum of visible feeling. He had loved Margot. This was not disputed by anyone who had seen them together in the years before the fever took her. What was disputed, quietly, and only among the senior staff who had known him longest, was whether the man who had emerged from that loss bore more than a passing resemblance to the man who had entered it. He had become, in Mrs. Cresswell's private assessment, a man who operated his life rather than lived it. The estate ran immaculately. The tenants were well served. The accounts were precise. And his daughter was fed and clothed and housed in one of the finest homes in Devonshire, and could not remember the last time her father had held her hand without a reason attached to it. Mrs. Cresswell stood in the breakfast-room doorway and watched the Duke read the Post with the focused attention he brought to correspondence, which was the same attention he brought to everything, thorough, efficient, and entirely contained. "Your Grace," she said. He looked up. "I will need to engage a replacement for Miss Faircloth. The child requires a nursemaid." He set the letter down. "Of course, use whatever agencies you see fit." Mrs. Cresswell did not move from the doorway. "If I may, Your Grace. The child has had 4 nursemaids in 14 months. The look he gave her was not cold, precisely, but it operated at a temperature that discouraged extended conversation. I am aware of the number, Mrs. Cresswell. The agencies are running short of candidates willing to take the position, Your Grace. Ashworth Hall has developed a reputation." "What sort of reputation?" "That the child is difficult." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "The child is not difficult," he said. "The child is grieving. There is a difference." Mrs. Cresswell noted this. She had been watching this man since he was a boy of 12, inheriting a title he was not ready for. And she noted that he had said the word grieving about his daughter without any apparent awareness that it applied equally to himself. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I will find someone. She found Lynette Thorne, or rather, Lynette Thorne found her. The letter arrived at Ashworth Hall on a Thursday, written in a hand that was neat and unhurried, on paper that was clean but not expensive, and it said in its entirety that Miss Lynette Thorne of Hartwell Village had heard through the Barnstaple registry that Ashworth Hall required a nursemaid, that she had 7 years of experience in the care of children, that she had references from 2 families in the county, and that she was available to begin immediately. There was no mention of wages. There was no mention of terms. There was no mention of the reputation that Mrs. Cresswell had referenced, which either meant the applicant had not heard it, or had heard it, and was not concerned. And Mrs. Cresswell was not sure which possibility she found more interesting. She interviewed Lynette Thorne on the following Monday. The woman who arrived at the servants' entrance at 9 o'clock was 26, neither plain nor pretty in a way that would cause comment, dressed in a gray dress that was well maintained and carefully pressed, with dark hair pinned back in a manner that said nothing about fashion and everything about a woman who did not waste time on things that did not require it. She had steady hands and a level gaze, and she sat in the housekeeper's parlor with the composure of someone who was not performing composure, but simply possessed it. Mrs. Cresswell asked the usual questions. She asked about the families she had served. She asked about her methods with children. She asked about discipline, about routine, about illness. She received answers that were specific, practical, and entirely free of the anxious elaboration that characterized candidates who were trying to impress rather than inform. Then she asked the question she had been saving. "The child does not speak easily to new people, Mrs. Cresswell said. She has had 4 nursemaids in just over a year. She did not warm to any of them." Lynette Thorne looked at her. She took her time answering, which Mrs. Cresswell noted. "How old is she?" Lynette said. 5, and her mother died when she was 3. "Yes." Lynette was quiet. Her gaze went to the window of the housekeeper's parlor, which faced the kitchen garden, where the September light was moving through the last of the summer herbs. "Then she does not need a nursemaid who expects to be warmed to," Lynette said. "She needs one who is willing to be in the room without requiring anything in return, until the child decides for herself." Mrs. Cresswell looked at this woman, who had said, in one sentence, what 4 previous nursemaids had not understood in a combined total of 14 months, and hired her on the spot. Lynette Thorne began at Ashworth Hall on the 1st day of October, which was a Wednesday, and she spent the first 3 days doing something that none of her predecessors had attempted. She did nothing. She was present. She was in the nursery when Lady Sable woke. She was in the schoolroom when Lady Sable sat with her books. She was in the garden when Lady Sable walked the paths along the south terrace in the afternoon, with the methodical pacing of a child who had made a routine of her solitude. But Lynette never spoke to the child unless the child spoke first. She arranged no activities. She suggested no games. She avoided the bright, determined cheerfulness that the previous nursemaids had deployed like a siege weapon against a 5-year-old's silence. She sat in the corner of the nursery with a piece of mending and was quiet, and was there. Lady Sable watched her. This was expected. The watching was the child's first language, the way she tested the weight of a new presence in her world, and Lynette understood it because she had once been a child who tested the world the same way, in a cottage in Hartwell, with a grandmother who had known that some children needed to choose their own timing, and that the worst thing you could do to a careful child was to rush her. On the 4th day, Lady Sable dropped a wooden horse from the nursery shelf. It fell behind the heavy chest beneath the window, in the gap between the chest and the wall, where a child's arm could not reach and an adult's arm could barely fit. Lynette heard it fall. She saw the child standing at the chest, looking down into the gap with the look of someone calculating whether the loss was worth the cost of asking for help. Lynette crossed the room. She knelt beside the chest, not beside the child, beside the chest, so that her attention was on the problem rather than on the girl. She worked her arm into the gap and retrieved the wooden horse and placed it on top of the chest. Then she held out her hand to the child, palm up, open, offering the horse back. She made no move to reach for the child's hand, made no move to close her fingers. She simply extended the open palm, with the horse resting in it, and waited. Lady Sable looked at the hand. She studied the woman attached to it. She looked with the complete, evaluating attention of a child who had been measuring adults against an internal standard since her mother's death and had found every one of them insufficient. She took the horse. She offered no thank you, no smile. She took the horse and returned to the window seat and resumed the private interior occupation that filled her mornings. And Lynette went back to her corner and her mending, and neither of them remarked on what had happened, which was, in the language of this particular child, the first conversation they had ever had. The Duke learned of the new nursemaid's existence in the way he learned of most domestic arrangements, through the weekly household report Mrs. Cresswell delivered each Friday morning. A new nursemaid has been engaged, Your Grace. Miss Lynette Thorne, from Hartwell Village. She began on Wednesday. He nodded. And the child? No difficulties reported, Your Grace. He returned to the estate accounts. Mrs. Cresswell remained in the doorway, considering whether to say more, and decided against it. It was too early. The woman had been in the house for 4 days. 4 days proved nothing. The previous nursemaids had lasted between 3 weeks and 4 months, and Mrs. Cresswell was not a woman who formed conclusions before the evidence was sufficient. But she had noticed something on the 3rd morning, when she had gone to the nursery to check the linen. Lynette Thorne had been sitting in the chair by the window, mending a hem, and Lady Sable had been at her small table with a picture book, and the room had been quiet, in a way that Mrs. Cresswell had not heard in the nursery since before the Duchess died. Not the quiet of absence, not the quiet of a child who had retreated into herself. The quiet of 2 people who were comfortable in the same room without needing to perform the fact of being there. Mrs. Cresswell had noted this and had said nothing, and had gone about her mourning. The 1st week became the 2nd. The 2nd became the 3rd. October moved through Ashworth Hall with the slow, golden patience of a Devonshire autumn, and Lynette Thorne remained in the nursery and did not leave, and did not threaten to leave, and did not show any indication that leaving was something she had considered or would consider. And Lady Sable watched this with the careful attention she brought to everything, and began, in increments so small that only someone paying very close attention would have noticed them, to move her chair closer to the window where Lynette sat. It was on a Thursday in the 3rd week that the Duke first encountered Lynette Thorne directly. He had come to the nursery, which he did on occasion, on a schedule that was regular enough to constitute a commitment and brief enough to constitute an evasion. He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter, who was sitting at the small table with a book of maps open before her, tracing coastlines with her finger, and at the woman in the chair by the window who was watching the child with an attention that was not supervisory. It was not the attention of a nursemaid monitoring a charge. It was something else, something less professional and more present, and the Duke observed it without being able to name it. "Miss Thorne," he said. She stood. "Your Grace." He looked at her with the complete, assessing attention he brought to all new elements of his household, the attention that categorized and filed and determined the appropriate level of engagement. She was dressed in the same gray he had been told about, neat, unremarkable, and she met his gaze with a steadiness that was not defiance and was not deference. It occupied a space between the two that he was not accustomed to from staff. "The child is well," he said. It was not a question. "She is, Your Grace." His eyes went to Sable, who had not looked up from her maps. She had registered his presence. He could see it in the slight tension along her shoulders, the way a child holds herself when she is aware of being observed by someone whose observation carries weight. But she never looked up. She never came to him. She continued tracing the coastline of Cornwall with her finger, and the Duke watched this and felt the thing he always felt in these moments, the gap between what he intended and what he was able to deliver, and did not know how to close it. "She seems settled," he said. Lynette looked at the child and then back at the Duke. "She is finding her way, Your Grace." He nodded. He stood in the doorway a breath longer, looking at his daughter across the room that was only 15 feet wide and felt considerably larger. And then he said, "Good morning," and left. And Lynette watched him go, a woman who had just learned something important about the architecture of this household. The child was not the one who was difficult to reach. The child was merely the one who had stopped reaching. The following Monday, the Duke sent word through Mrs. Cresswell that he wished to see Lynette Thorne in the study at 4 o'clock. This was unusual. Nursemaids did not meet with the Duke. Nursemaids reported to the housekeeper, who reported to the Duke, and the chain of authority was clear and had been clear at Ashworth Hall for 3 generations. Lynette received the message, changed her apron, checked her hair in the nursery mirror, because she understood that appearances were a language, and that the Duke of Ashworth read that language fluently, and went downstairs at 5 minutes to 4. The study was on the ground floor, south-facing, with heavy curtains and a desk that could have served as a fortification. The Duke was behind it. He did not stand when she entered, which told her something. He gestured to the chair across the desk, which told her something else. She sat. "I have been told," the Duke said, "that my daughter has begun speaking to you." Lynette looked at him. "She has, Your Grace. Small things. Questions about the garden, the names of birds she sees from the nursery window." The Duke was quiet for a moment. She has not spoken voluntarily to an adult outside this household in 7 months. Lynette said nothing. She understood that this was not a conversation that required her to fill the silences. The Duke was working through something, and the something was not about her. "I want to be clear about your position, Miss Thorne," he said. He folded his hands on the desk in a way that was deliberate, a man arranging his words before delivering them. "You are the nursemaid. Your role is the care and supervision of the child, her physical well-being, her routine, her daily needs." He paused. "That is the entirety of your function." Lynette looked at him. "My daughter has lost her mother," he continued, "and the household has been through considerable difficulty as a result. What she requires is stability, consistency, a reliable adult presence that does not overcomplicate the situation by attempting to fill a role that is not yours." He met her eyes. "She does not need another mother, Miss Thorne. She needs a nursemaid who understands the distinction." The room was very still. The October afternoon light came through the south window and fell across the desk between them, and Lynette sat in the chair and looked at this man who had just told her, in the most precise language available to him, exactly how frightened he was. Because that was what she heard. Not authority, not instruction, not a duke clarifying the terms of employment. She heard a man who had watched 4 women try to love his daughter and leave, and who had decided that the solution was to prevent the 5th from trying at all. She heard the wound underneath the policy, and she understood, with the clarity she brought to all important things, that the policy was not about her. It was about Margot. It was about a woman who had been everything to this child and had died, and about a man who had concluded that the safest thing he could do for his daughter was to ensure that no one else was ever allowed close enough for the losing to matter. She could have argued. She had the argument ready. She could have told him that a child who chooses to speak after 7 months of silence is not responding to supervision. She is responding to something else entirely, and that something else is precisely the thing he had just told her not to provide. She could have told him that stability without warmth is a house without a fire, and that his daughter already lived in enough cold rooms. She did not argue. She studied the Duke across his desk, the set of his jaw, and the careful arrangement of his hands, and the particular quality of stillness that she now understood his daughter had inherited, not as temperament, but as survival, and she made the decision that would define everything that followed. She stood. She inclined her head. Not a curtsy, not quite. Something that acknowledged his rank and his instruction, without conceding that either of them was correct. "I understand your position, Your Grace," she said. "I will care for your daughter within the boundaries you have described." She paused, and she did something she had not planned, something that came from the part of her that had been raised by a grandmother who believed that the truth should be offered once, clearly, and then left alone to do its work. "I will say one thing, Your Grace, and I will not raise it again. A child who has stopped reaching for people has not stopped needing them. She has simply learned that reaching costs more than she can afford." She met his gaze. "Your daughter does not need me to be her mother, but she does need someone in that nursery who is not afraid to love her. And with respect, Your Grace, being afraid on her behalf is not the same thing as protecting her." The study was very quiet. The Duke looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between surprise and recognition, the look of a man who has been told something he already knew by someone he had not expected to say it. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," she said. She turned and left the study. She closed the door behind her with the careful, unhurried precision of a woman who had said what needed saying and was not going to stand in the room waiting for it to be received. She walked back upstairs to the nursery, where Lady Sable was sitting at the window seat with the wooden horse in her lap, watching the south garden in the last of the October light. Lynette sat down in her chair. She picked up her mending. She made no mention of the study, or the Duke, or the conversation. After a while, Lady Sable said, without looking away from the window, "What is the bird with the brown chest?" Lynette looked. "A robin," she said. The child was quiet for a moment. "Does it stay in winter?" "It does," Lynette said. "It is one of the ones that stays." The child considered this. Her eyes moved from the robin on the garden wall to Lynette and back again. "Good," she said, and returned to the window and the horse and the careful private accounting she kept of the things in her world that did not leave. November came to Devonshire with rain and the particular gray patience of a county that understood winter as a long negotiation rather than an event. Lynette Thorne remained at Ashworth Hall. She did not mention the study conversation again. She made no alteration to her manner with the child. She continued to sit in the nursery each morning with her mending, continued to answer questions when they were asked, continued to extend the open palm whenever something needed to be handed over, or offered or returned, and continued to be the kind of presence that Lady Sable could rely on without being required to admit that she was relying on it. The child's questions increased. This happened gradually enough that a less attentive household might not have noticed, but Ashworth Hall was a house that noticed things, being small enough and quiet enough, and staffed by people who had been there long enough that any change in the child registered like a shift in weather. The questions were never large. They were the questions of a child rebuilding a practice she had abandoned. What is the tree with the white bark? Why does the rain sound different on the east windows? Where do the kitchen cats go in winter? Each question was delivered in the same measured tone, without looking directly at Lynette, as though the question were addressed to the room in general, and Lynette happened to be the most convenient person in it. Lynette answered each one with the same unhurried attention. She never praised the child for asking, never reacted to the questions as though they were breakthroughs, though Mrs. Cresswell, who overheard 2 of them from the corridor, had to excuse herself to the linen closet to manage her expression. She simply answered, and waited, and was there for the next one. By the 3rd week of November, Lady Sable had moved her chair to within 4 feet of the window where Linnet sat. She had not announced this. She had simply moved it, an inch or 2 each day, with the incremental determination of a child who was approaching something on her own terms and would not be hurried. The Duke noticed. He noticed because he came to the nursery on a Friday afternoon, his regular visit, and found the geography of the room altered. His daughter's table, which had been in the center of the room since the nursery was arranged after Margot's death, was now positioned near the window, within arm's reach of Linnet's chair. The 2 of them were sitting in the November light, Linnet mending, Sable turning the pages of an illustrated guide to coastal birds that Linnet had brought from her own collection. And the room had the quality of stillness that he recognized from before, from when Margot was alive, and the nursery had been a room where his daughter was at ease, rather than merely contained. He stood in the doorway and watched this arrangement and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was relief, which was genuine and immediate, and which he would have admitted to if asked. The second was something he would not have admitted to, something that lived in the space between the relief and the recognition that the relief had been produced by someone else, someone who was not him, someone who had accomplished in 7 weeks what he had not managed since Margot died. He said nothing about the rearranged furniture. He conducted his visit with the usual precision. He asked Sable about her lessons. She answered in short, correct sentences. He told her that the south garden would be replanted in spring, and that she might choose a flower for the border if she wished. She said she would think about it. He said good afternoon and left. And at the door he paused and looked back and saw Linnet extend her hand to the child, palm up, offering a pencil that Sable had been looking for, and watched his daughter take it from the open palm with the easy, unconsidered trust of a child who had stopped measuring the cost of reaching. He turned away from this and went downstairs to his study and sat behind his desk and did not open the accounts for several minutes. December brought the hard frost, and with it the first crisis that tested the architecture of the household. Lady Sable developed a fever on a Tuesday night. It began as a cough at supper, and by midnight had become the kind of fever that makes a household move quickly and quietly, and with the focused fear that attends any illness in a child who has already lost one parent, and whose remaining parent has not fully recovered from the losing. Mrs. Cresswell sent for the physician. The physician, Dr. Pembrose, arrived from Barnstaple at 2:30 in the morning, examined the child, pronounced it a chest cold that required careful management but did not yet warrant serious alarm, prescribed willow bark tea and steam and constant monitoring, and left instructions that someone was to remain with the child through the night. Linnet was already there. She had been there since 10 o'clock, when she had heard the cough change from the dry, ordinary cough of a child with a cold to the deeper, wetter sound that meant the chest was involved. She had moved to the nursery without being asked, had built the fire up, had set water to steam on the grate, had propped the child's pillows to ease her breathing, and had been sitting beside the bed in the straight-backed chair, with her hand resting on the coverlet near the child's hand, not holding it. Near it, the open palm turned upward in the dark, available, when Mrs. Cresswell arrived with the physician. The Duke came to the nursery at 3 in the morning. He had been woken by Mrs. Cresswell, who had judged the situation serious enough to warrant informing him, and not so serious that informing him was an act of alarm. He came upstairs in his coat over his nightshirt, moving with controlled urgency, a man who had already learned what it felt like to lose someone in this house, and who carried that knowledge in his body like a second skeleton. He found Linnet at the bedside. The nursery was warm, the fire well managed, the steam rising from the basin on the grate. Sable was sleeping, her breathing audible but steady, and Lynette was sitting in the chair with her hand on the coverlet, and she remained seated when the Duke entered, which was a breach of protocol that neither of them acknowledged, because standing would have meant moving her hand from where the child could find it if she woke. "How is she?" the Duke said from the doorway. His voice was the one she had not heard before, not the study voice, not the nursery visit voice, the one underneath them, the one that had no authority in it and no management, just the raw, unprocessed sound of a father who was frightened. "The fever is steady," Lynette said, "not rising. Dr. Pembrose expects it to break by morning if we keep the steam constant and the room warm." The Duke came further into the room. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his daughter, who was small and flushed and breathing with the effortful regularity of a child whose body was working hard, and his hands were at his sides, and Lynette could see that he did not know what to do with them. "She has been asking for the wooden horse," Lynette said. "I put it beside her pillow. She finds it a comfort." The Duke looked at the wooden horse. It was the one from the shelf, the one that had fallen behind the chest in October, the one that Lynette had retrieved and offered back on the open palm. He noticed the horse, and Lynette saw him register the object and its history, and its presence here beside his daughter's pillow at 3 a.m. And she saw him understand something about the weight of small things. He sat down, not in the chair by the door, where a duke conducting a supervisory visit would sit. He pulled the other straight-backed chair to the opposite side of the bed from Lynette and sat down, and the two of them were there on either side of the child in the December dark, with the fire and the steam and the sound of breathing between them. They did not speak for a long while. The fire settled. The steam rose. Sable shifted once in her sleep, and her hand moved across the coverlet and found Lynette's open palm and rested there, the small fingers curling loosely around the larger ones, and the Duke watched this happen and did not look away. "Has she done that before?" he said quietly. "Yes, Your Grace. How often?" "Most nights," Lynette said, "when I sit with her until she falls asleep. She finds the hand before she finds sleep." The Duke was quiet for a very long time after this. The fire shifted again. The room was warm and close and dark, except for the single candle on the mantel and the glow from the grate. And in this light, the Duke of Ashworth looked less like a duke and more like a man sitting beside a bed because he did not know where else to be. "You were here before Mrs. Cresswell sent for you," he said. "I was not sent for," Lynette said. "I heard the cough change. You knew the difference. My grandmother raised 3 children through 4 winters, in a cottage with no physician within 10 miles, Lynette said. "I know what a cough sounds like when it moves to the chest." He looked at her across the bed. She met his gaze. The candlelight was behind her, and her face was in partial shadow, and she was not performing anything. She was sitting beside a sick child in the middle of the night, because this was where she belonged, and the fact of it was so plain and so undecorated that it did not require a response. He looked away first. His eyes moved from his daughter's hand in Lynette's palm to the wooden horse beside the pillow. He said nothing further, and they sat together through the rest of the night, and the fever broke at dawn, exactly as Dr. Pembrose had predicted. And when Sable opened her eyes in the thin December morning light, the first thing she saw was Lynette, and the first thing she did was tighten her fingers around the hand that was already there. The Duke saw this too. He was still in the chair on the other side. He had not slept. He had watched the night pass with the attention of a man keeping vigil, and he had watched his daughter's hand in the nursemaid's palm, and he had thought about boundaries and roles and the careful distinctions he had drawn in his study in October, and he had found them in the 3 o'clock dark with his daughter's breathing filling the room, considerably less clear than they had been when he had spoken them. He left the nursery at 7, when Mrs. Cresswell arrived with broth and fresh linen. He thanked Linnet at the door. It was a single word. He said it without the formal register, without the title, without the architecture of rank. He said thank you, and she said, "You are welcome," and he went downstairs, and the word he had used settled between them like a stone dropped into water, simple and small, and altering the surface of everything around it. The Devonshire County Christmas Assembly was held on the 20th of December at Thornbury House, the home of Sir Aldous and Lady Penvarden, which was the largest private residence in the district, and which the Penvardens had been opening for the Christmas Assembly for 22 years, with the practiced generosity of people who understood that hosting was a form of authority, and that the Christmas Assembly was the occasion on which the county's social architecture was most thoroughly displayed. Lady Penvarden was 53, handsome in the preserved, maintained way of a woman who considered her appearance a professional obligation, and she had been the foremost social presence in the Devonshire district since before the old Duke had died. She knew everything about everyone. She knew it with the comprehensive, catalogued attention of a woman who had decided early in life that information was the most reliable form of power, and she had applied this principle for 3 decades with results that the county respected and occasionally feared. She knew about Linnet Thorne. She knew about the nursemaid from Hartwell Village, who had lasted longer than the previous 4. She knew because Mrs. Cresswell's second housemaid had a sister who worked at Thornbury, that the child had begun speaking again, and that the nursemaid sat with her at night, and that the Duke had spent a night in the nursery during the child's illness, which was a detail that had traveled through the servants' networks of 3 households in 4 days, and had arrived at Lady Penvarden's breakfast table on a Saturday morning with the inevitability of weather. The Duke attended the Christmas assembly with Sable, which was itself unusual. He had attended the previous year's assembly alone, having left Sable at Ashworth with the second nursemaid, and the year before, that he had not attended at all, the grief being too recent and the social effort too great. This year he arrived with the child at his side, and Linnet Thorne 2 steps behind, in the position that a nursemaid occupied at such events, present for the child's needs and otherwise invisible. Lady Penvarden received them in the entrance hall with the warm, assessing efficiency of a practiced hostess. "Your Grace." And Lady Sable. "How well she looks." Sable did look well. The fever had passed without complication, and the child who stood in the entrance hall of Thornbury House was not the silent, retreated child of September. She was still quiet. She was still watchful, but there was something in her bearing that had not been there 4 months ago, a quality of presence rather than absence, as though she had decided, tentatively and on her own terms, to rejoin the world of people who were worth paying attention to. The assembly proceeded as these assemblies did. 40 people, the full district, the drawing room and the dining room opened into one continuous space for the occasion, and the county moved through it with the fluid, practiced choreography of people who had been doing this together for years and understood the steps without requiring instruction. The Duke managed his part of the evening with the precision Linnet had come to expect. He spoke with Sir Aldous about the winter roads. He spoke with the rector about the parish roof. He moved through the room treating social obligation as a subset of estate management and performed it accordingly. Sable stayed close to Linnet. This was expected. A child of 5 at an adult assembly would naturally remain with her nursemaid, and Linnet kept to the edges of the room with Sable beside her, answering the child's quiet questions about the people and the house and the tall candles in the dining room that Sable found fascinating. They were standing near the east window when Lady Penvarden found them. She arrived with the materialization of a woman who had been watching the room and had chosen her moment. She had 2 other women with her, Lady Denning and Mrs. Ashcroft, and the 3 of them arranged themselves around Lynette and the child with the transparent choreography of people who have come to observe something and wish to appear as though they have simply wandered over. "The child seems very attached to you," Lady Penvarden said to Lynette, with the warm, interested tone that people who did not know her might have mistaken for kindness. Lynette looked at her. "She is settling well, my lady." "Settling," Lady Penvarden smiled. Lady Torium, the smile had the quality of an instrument being tuned. "4 nursemaids before you, I understand. Quite the distinction to have lasted this long." Lynette said nothing. She understood the architecture of this conversation. She had grown up in a village where the wives of the county families spoke to the village women with precisely this tone, warm and interested, and placing you exactly where they wanted you in the same sentence. "One does wonder," Lady Penvarden continued, glancing at Lady Denning with the practiced timing of a woman delivering a performance, "whether the attachment is entirely—" She paused. "Appropriate. The word did the work it was designed to do. That is to say," she continued, "a child of Lady Sable's position requires a certain kind of guidance. A nursemaid is a nursemaid, of course. One does not want the child to become confused about where she might look for." Another pause, longer than the first. "For the things that a nursemaid cannot provide." Lynette held her gaze. She held it with the composure of a woman who had heard this particular variety of condescension before, in smaller rooms and from less polished mouths, and who understood that the correct response was not the satisfying one. She was formulating that correct response when Sable moved. The child had been standing beside Lynette throughout this exchange, and Lynette had assumed she was occupied with the candles and the room and the general spectacle of 40 adults in evening dress. She had underestimated the child. Lady Sable had been listening with the complete, unblinking attention she brought to everything, and she had understood, with the categorical clarity of a 5-year-old, who had spent her short life cataloging the tones of voice that adults used when they were being unkind, exactly what Lady Penvarden was doing. And Lady Sable Trevane, who had not voluntarily touched another person in 7 months before October, who had measured every adult in her world against an internal standard and found them wanting, who kept a private accounting of the things that stayed and the things that left, reached up and took Lynette's hand. Not the open palm. Lynette had not offered it. The child reached for the hand and took it, fingers closing around Lynette's with the deliberate, declarative grip of a child who was making a statement to a room that had not asked for one, but was going to receive it regardless. Lady Penvarden looked at the joined hands. Her eyes fell on the child's face, which was turned toward Lynette with an expression that Lady Penvarden, for all her comprehensive social intelligence, had not anticipated and was not equipped to dismiss. Lady Denning shifted beside her. Mrs. Ashcroft studied the middle distance. The Duke's voice arrived from behind them. "Lady Penvarden, he was there." Lynette did not know how long he had been there, whether he had heard the beginning of the conversation or only the end. But he was standing 2 paces behind Lady Penvarden, with the expression she had seen once before in the study in October, except that in October it had been directed at her, and now it was directed at someone else entirely. "Miss Thorne has been with us since October," the Duke said, in the voice that was not raised and did not need to be, the one that had 200 years of Devonshire in it, and understood precisely what weight it carried. "In that time, my daughter has resumed speaking after 7 months of silence. She has recovered from a chest fever under Miss Thorne's care that the physician himself commended. And she is standing in this room tonight, at a social occasion, for the first time in 2 years." He looked at Lady Penvarden with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was not interested in being interrupted. If the attachment you have observed is that my daughter trusts the woman who cares for her, then I would suggest that the attachment is not only appropriate, but long overdue. And I would suggest that anyone who finds it objectionable has misunderstood what appropriate means in the context of a child who has lost her mother. The room around them had gone very quiet, not silent. The assembly continued, but the 8 or 9 people within hearing distance had stopped their conversations with the careful, attentive stillness of people who understood. They were witnessing something that would be discussed for the remainder of the winter. Lady Penvarden's smile underwent a recalibration. "Of course, Your Grace. I merely wished to the Duke did not wait for her to finish." His gaze moved to Lynette, then to Sable's hand clasped in hers, and something crossed his face, an expression that Lynette had not catalogued before. Something that was not the study expression, and not the nursery visit expression, and not the 3 o'clock expression from the night of the fever. Something that had no management in it at all. Then he returned to the conversation he had been having with Sir Aldous, as though nothing had occurred, and Lady Penvarden found someone else to talk to quickly and composedly, a woman corrected in her own house, who required a moment to revise her position. Sable did not let go of Lynette's hand for the rest of the evening. Mrs. Creswell found the Duke in the study the following morning. He was at his desk, which was where he always was at 8 o'clock, but the accounts were closed, and the post was unopened, and he was looking at the south window, but his eyes were not seeing the garden beyond it. She stood in the doorway. She had been standing in this doorway for 22 years, delivering household reports and domestic information, and the small, accumulated truths of a house that she understood better than anyone alive. She had stood in this doorway when his father died. She had stood in it when he married Margot. She had stood in it on the morning after Margot's death, when the Duke had come downstairs at 7 o'clock and opened the accounts and begun working as though the world had not changed entirely in the night. She had been waiting for this particular morning for some time. "Your Grace," she said. He looked up. "I wish to speak with you about the child," she paused, "and about Miss Thorne." He was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured to the chair across the desk, which was the first time in 22 years he had offered Mrs. Creswell a seat in the study. She sat. She folded her hands. She looked at the man she had known since he was 12 years old and said what she had been saving. "Your Grace, I have watched you manage this household and this estate with more discipline and more care than any man I have served. You have done everything correctly. The accounts are in order. The tenants are well treated. The house is maintained." She paused. "And your daughter has been drowning in front of you for 2 years, and you have been standing on the bank, keeping the ledger of the water level instead of reaching in." The Duke did not speak. "Miss Thorne reached in," Mrs. Creswell said. "She reached in without permission, and without regard for the boundaries you set, and your daughter took her hand. She took it, Your Grace. And last night at the assembly, when Lady Penvarden made her remarks, your daughter did not reach for you. She reached for the nursemaid. The study was very still. I do not say this to wound you," Mrs. Creswell said. "I say this because I have watched you punish yourself for Margot's death by refusing to be the thing your daughter needs. Because being that thing means risking the kind of loss you have already survived once, and do not believe you can survive again." She met his eyes. "But your daughter is alive, Your Grace. She is here, and she has chosen someone to love. The question is whether you are going to let that be enough, or whether you are going to stand in the doorway of the nursery for the rest of her childhood, conducting visits." She stood. She had said what needed saying, the way Lynette had said what needed saying in October, plainly and once, and she was not going to sit in the room, waiting for it to be received. "Your Grace," she said, and left. The Duke sat in the study for a long time after Mrs. Cresswell left. He sat with the accounts closed and the post unopened and the December morning light moving across the desk. And he thought about doorways. He thought about every doorway in this house, the nursery where he stood on Fridays, the study where Mrs. Cresswell stood each morning, the bedroom where Margot had died, which he had not entered since the morning after her death. All the thresholds in this house that he approached and stood at and didn't cross, because crossing meant being inside, and being inside meant that when the room emptied again, he would feel it in a way he could not manage. He thought about Lynette Thorne's hand on the coverlet in the dark, palm up, and his daughter's fingers finding it. He thought about the open palm and what it meant, the offering without demand, the presence without condition, the hand that said, "I am here, and you choose." And he understood with the clarity that arrives only when a man has run out of ways to avoid understanding, that the open palm was the thing he had been unable to do. Not because he did not love his daughter, because he loved her so completely that the thought of offering himself and being passed over, being found insufficient, being not enough, was a devastation he had been organizing his entire life since Margot's death to avoid. And Lynette Thorne, a nursemaid from Hartwell Village, in a gray dress with steady hands and a level gaze, had walked into his house and done the thing he could not do, simply and without ceremony, and without requiring anything in return. And his daughter had taken the hand. He went upstairs. Lynette was in the nursery. Sable was at the window seat with the bird book, and the room had the quiet, settled quality that he had come to recognize as the sound of his daughter being at ease. He stood in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, aware of the threshold, aware of the habit, aware of Mrs. Cresswell's words about standing on the bank. He stepped into the room. Lynette looked up. She started to rise. He shook his head. "Stay," he said. "Please." He crossed the nursery. 15 feet of floor that he had been crossing without ever truly arriving, and he stopped beside his daughter at the window seat and looked down at her. And she looked up at him with her gray eyes that were his eyes, and he saw in them the same careful, measuring attention that he recognized because it was his own, the attention of a person deciding whether this was going to cost more than it was worth. He knelt. He had never knelt in the nursery. He had stood, and he had sat in the chair by the door, and he had conducted his visits from the full height of his authority and his grief, and now he was on his knees on the nursery floor, and his face was level with his daughter's face, and he could see her clearly, and she could see him, without the architecture of distance he had built between them. Sable looked at him. She looked at him with the complete, unblinking attention she brought to everything that mattered, and he understood that he was being measured, the way Lynette had been measured in October, and that the only thing he could do was remain where he was and let the measuring happen. He held out his hand, palm up, open. The way he had watched Lynette do it 100 times, the offering without demand, the hand that said, "I am here, and you choose." His daughter looked at the hand. She looked at Lynette, who was sitting in her chair by the window, watching this with the expression of a woman who was seeing something she had been waiting to see and was not going to interfere with by moving or speaking or breathing too loudly. Sable looked back at her father's hand, and Lady Sable Trevane, 5 years old, who had lost her mother and found her silence and kept a private accounting of the things in her world that stayed, reached out and placed her hand in her father's open palm. His fingers closed around hers, gently, with the careful, deliberate grip of a man who was holding something he understood. Finally, and without any remaining defense against the understanding, was the most important thing he had ever been given. He looked at Lynette across the room. She met his gaze. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not professional and was not managed, and she did not look away, and he did not look away. And between them on the window seat, a child held her father's hand for the first time in 2 years. "Miss Thorne," the Duke said. His voice was not the study voice. It was not any of the voices she had catalogued. It was a new one. "Your Grace." "I was wrong," he said. "In October." What I said in the study. The boundaries I described. He paused. He glanced down at his daughter's hand in his. "I told you she did not need another mother. I told you she needed a nursemaid who understood the distinction." "Yes, Your Grace. The distinction," he said, was the wrong framework entirely. His eyes found Lynette. She did not need a nursemaid or a mother. She needed someone who was willing to love her without a title attached to it, without a role, without a policy governing the terms. He paused. "You did that." I could not. And I could not, because I had made my grief into a rule and called it protection, and enforced it on a child who needed the opposite of protection, who needed the door left open. Lynette looked at the man kneeling on the nursery floor with his daughter's hand in his and his accounting finally, entirely revised, and she thought about October, about the study and the speech about boundaries, and about the woman she had been in that chair, hearing the wound underneath the policy, and choosing to say one true thing and leave it alone to do its work. The work was done. "You were frightened," she said. "Not wrong. Frightened. There is a difference, and it matters, because a man who is wrong can be corrected, but a man who is frightened has to find his own way to the door." Her gaze rested on Sable's hand in his. "You found it?" He was quiet. His gaze drifted to the window, the December garden, the bare branches and the gray sky, and a robin sitting on the garden wall in the cold, the one that stayed in winter, and his daughter saw it too and pointed. "The robin," Sable said. Her eyes found Lynette, then her father. "It stayed." "It did," the Duke said, and he looked at Lynette when he said it, and the word was not about the bird, and they both knew it, and the nursery was warm, and the December morning was outside, and a child held her father's hand on the window seat and pointed at a bird that had not left, and nothing about any of it required management. Mrs. Cresswell was informed by the kitchen maid, who had it from the upstairs maid, who had seen it through the nursery door, that the Duke had spent 40 minutes on the nursery floor with his daughter that morning, and that when he had left, he had walked past the study without going in, and had gone instead to the garden, where he had stood for some time, looking at the south wall where the winter birds gathered. She received this information in the housekeeper's parlor with a cup of tea and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had just been told it had arrived. She said nothing. She finished her tea. She went about her morning. In the days that followed, the architecture of Ashworth Hall shifted in ways that were small and cumulative and understood by everyone in the household without anyone naming them aloud. The Duke began coming to the nursery without a schedule. He came when he wanted to come, which was different from coming when the routine required it. And the difference was visible in the way he entered the room, not pausing at the threshold, not conducting a visit, simply arriving and being present and sitting in the chair that was no longer by the door, but had been moved, by no one in particular and everyone in general, to the window where Lynette sat and Sable read her books. He asked Sable about the birds. He asked her about the maps. He learned the names of the coastal birds she had memorized from Lynette's book, and she told him with the careful, specific enthusiasm of a child who has discovered that enthusiasm is safe, that it will not be received with polite distance and a formal good afternoon, but will be met where it lives. He learned this from Lynette, not in words. Lynette did not instruct him, did not guide him, did not manage his approach to his own daughter, She simply continued to do what she had always done, sitting in the chair, mending, answering questions, extending the open palm, and the Duke watched and learned the way a man learns a language by living in the country where it is spoken, through immersion and repetition and the slow, irreversible recognition that the language makes sense. On Christmas morning, Sable came downstairs to the drawing room where the household gifts were arranged, and the Duke was there, and Lynette was there, and Mrs. Cresswell was there in the doorway where she always was, and the child walked into the room and stopped and looked at the three adults and made her choice. She went to Lynette first. She went to her and took her hand, the reaching hand, the one that no longer waited for the open palm but went looking for it. And then she turned and extended her other hand to her father. Palm up, open, the gesture she had learned from the woman who had taught her that love was not something you waited for, but something you offered. The Duke looked at his daughter's open palm. He looked at the hand extended to him by a 5-year-old child who had learned from a nursemaid in a gray dress the thing he had been unable to teach her, which was that the people who stay are the ones worth reaching for, and that reaching is not a risk, but a decision, and that the decision is the whole of it. He took her hand. The three of them stood in the drawing room of Ashworth Hall on Christmas morning, linked by the hands of a child who had placed herself in the middle and claimed them both, and Mrs. Cresswell watched from the doorway with her hands folded, and the expression of a woman who had served this house for 22 years and was seeing, for the first time since a duchess had died, in an upstairs bedroom, something that looked like the beginning of a family. The robin was on the garden wall outside the drawing room window. Sable saw it through the glass. "Look," she said. She said it to both of them. It stayed.